Greetings and welcome to this tutorial on looping structures inside a UiPath Studio. Again, we will continue with our usual standard here of going into a new project, creating a new process. So go into new project via process. For our name here, let's simply call it looping. For my location, same thing, I'm trying to stick with my same folder path that I've been using for all my other previous project work. In this case, playing around with for each, while, and do while loops. Once you have this ready to go, simply hit create. Once we get our project built, do as we've been doing to this point, go into your main workflow again, either by clicking on the open main workflow here, or the other way again, you can hit your project tab and go into the main example here. Either accomplishes the same end result. So what I want to do here, first things first, we have to have a little bit of data to play around with. So I'm going to stick with our old adage that we've been using to this point. I'm going to create a new array here that we can actually walk through our loop. In order to do that, I need to first bring a sequence activity in. So I've got an object that I can actually declare a variable within. So once I'm on the sequence tab, I'm going to expand variables. What I mean as before, let's stay with our old adage of str years as a array of strings. I'm going to go down to array of t and say string array. So all I have done to this point is I added a new sequence. Then I went to variables tab. Str years is the name I gave it. Then I'm currently working on, I made this selection here of array of t, and I selected string, so creating a string array here. Again, I could bring in an assign activity and populate the str years. In this case, I want to cheat a little bit and use the default value. We'll call an array uses the open and closing curly brackets. And I'm going to simply go through and quickly generate some years that we can play around with. 2019, 2020, 2021. And we'll go 2023 on the other end. So 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and in this case 23. Again, open, close, curly brackets because we're dealing with an array. And then it's a matter of, since I've got it declared a string array, I'm using double quotes around each of the values delimited by comma. So index value 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. What I want to be able to do first is demonstrate a for each loop activity. And the nature of a for each loop activity is responsible for walking us through one record at a time through any type of list type structure. So in this case, an array being a list of years. So what we are going to do is go to our activities and type in for each. I want to call out a couple things here right up front. Notice we have a data table for each row. We will come back to this in a future activity when we specifically talk about data tables. So we do not want to bring this activity across. The one that we're going after here is under workflow control and specifically for each. Bring the for each one over and not the for each row. This one is exclusive for using a data table. This one here, you'll notice it talks about performs an activity or a series of activities on each element of an enumeration. Think of an enumeration as nothing more than some type of list type data type. In this case, we're using a string array. It's in a roundabout way, an enumeration thing to the list. So being able to walk through item by item through the list and getting each value back. So the way the for each activity works as we bring it across, in this enter a VB expression, it is looking for what list do you want to actually traverse through or walk through, go item by item, 17, 18, and so on. So in this box here, we specify str years. And what happens here is kind of an interesting phenomenon. What it's going to do is take each individual item out of here and place it into this variable here. Notice this is not a variable we have to define. This is kind of built-in defined as part of the activity itself. We can rename this whatever we would like. In this case, it would be appropriate to call this year. The reason I say that is as it walks through every record in the array, it's going to put one value at a time into this variable of year. Since we're dealing with years, it's appropriate to change item to, in this case, year. This will make a bit more context when we start piecing this together. Another important thing to call out with a for each activity is this type argument. What this does is this is really the variable definition for this value that we just talked about, in this case, year. What type of data is year? By default, the for each loop will always use object. Remember, object being more of a generic holder. Notice what I try to do is stay consistent. This is a string array. So what I always recommend is to ensure that the type argument matches whatever type of value is in your array or list, your enumeration, as we heard a moment ago. So in this case, it would be very appropriate to change this to string. So all the values at the list is years, and it's going to return back to us, in this case, strings, and store each item in this variable here that's kind of built in the for each loop again, the value of year. Let's bring a right line activity in to demonstrate what is going on in this case. What I want to do is specify the value here of year. Notice it's already pre-populating for me. Since we declared this as a string, remember right line is expecting a string, so we don't have to do any typecasting. If you would have left year up here as a object, so you don't need to follow along with this specific step, I'm just purely doing this for demonstration purposes. If I change it to object, you'll notice I get an error here. Then the reason why is it's expecting, notice here, it's complaining about an object to string. What I was trying to demonstrate here is you have to convert the object to a string in a right line to get it back to where we don't have an error. But that's where, yet again, I always highly recommend that we keep the data type of whatever it is that's in our list consistent with the value that's going into the for each. So in this case, this is again of type string. Making that change and leaving the toString in here doesn't affect anything. Notice there are no errors. This is obviously a bit over redundant. What it's doing is saying take a string now that we changed it back to string and convert a string into a string. So in this case, we don't need this any longer. Notice the error goes away. Again, that's because of the type argument here. Highly important. If I run my automation at this point, we should get a list of every year, one after another, as output in our output window. And you will notice we have gotten exactly that. What it has done is it's walked through our list. Notice 2017 was the first item in the years array. That's the first item outputted. And then the next value being 18 and so on until we got to the end of 2023, and then code execution stopped. This is how a for each loop works. It literally says start at the beginning of a list and go to the end of a list. In this case, one at a time, it populates the value year. So we kind of broke this apart in a bit more context or detail. It starts with, what is our list? The very first time it goes in, it takes the first value and places it in year for us. We don't have to do anything more. It's automatically done for us. At this rate, 2017 goes into year. And that's how since we had the right line activity, we could have as many activities in here as we want inside the body over for each, whatever logic needs to be done. In our case, for doing purely a demonstration here, so we're returning back the year. Where 2017 is in year, that's how we got the output of 17. When it hits the bottom of the for each loop, notice where the blue line ends. It comes back up. Is going to ask kind of a question behind the scenes. It's going to say, is there another value in our list? What's the next value in the list if there is another value? In this case, it's 2018. And now assigns 2018 into year, goes into the body. The only activity we've got in this case is to print out the year 2018. That's how we get the year. In this case, 2018. Loops back again. Is there another value? What's the next value if there is one? Oh, we've got another one, 2019, and it continues that same sequence until we get down to 2023. So let's say we came out on 2022, came back up. Is there another value? Yes, it's 2023. We print out the year, it comes back up again. It says, is there another value after 2023? It says there is not. So at that point, we exit out of the for each loop. We don't have any more years to process. So the code would resume immediately below the blue block. So whatever activity shows up down here and then resumes with our sequence further down. So simply allowing code to repeat itself, hence the concept that we're talking about of a loop. It's in a looping structure here, going from top to bottom, go back up to the beginning again, start over as long as there's data to be processed, and then escapes. So to demonstrate this maybe a little bit more, if I bring a right line above the for each loop, feel free to do this. Say this line shows up before, put this in caps, before we start the for each loop. I'm going to copy this text again so everybody can see it real quick. This line shows up before we start the for each loop. You know what? I copied that text. Why don't I just copy the whole right line activity? What I want to do is put this underneath the for each loop. I need to be careful where I place this. So to do this, I want to click on the for each activity. I want to follow that real light blue line underneath. I want to make sure this falls in outside of the loop. So notice the blue line for the for each loop here. The activity right under is here. I want to say this line shows up after, instead of saying start, after we complete the for each loop. So if I run this automation with these two new right lines, you'll see that the for each loop does not include the logic that we just add those two right lines. So it says this shows up before. There's our loop then 17, 18, 19 like we had before. Then on the other side, this shows up after. And then if we add additional activities below, obviously that's when we get into the additional code further below. But you know, it's the looping structure here based on our output that we've seen displayed here. There are two other notable loops that we need to include in this conversation as well. And these two are similar yet very fundamentally different. What we are talking about here is do while and while loops. So I did a search on activity of while, and you notice these two show up down here at the bottom. I'm going to bring the while loop in first. And then right underneath it, I'm going to bring in a do while loop. And the major thing that I want to call out here from a demonstration point of view is the way each of these two activities are set up. And what I'm trying to get at here is notice on a while loop, the condition box shows up above the body. If I go to the do while loop, notice the body is above the condition. The condition here is at the end. So condition at the end in a do while loop, and the condition is before the body in a while loop. The condition is simply looking for, if I hover over in our properties window, it's expecting a Boolean value. So think of our if statements before. It's waiting for the condition to go from true to false. It will continue to stay in the loop as long as whatever the condition we're checking is true. So we'll run through an example of this here in just a moment, but it's the idea of, whatever the condition is that we're checking, it's got to be a statement that resolves to a Boolean value. So go back to when we talked about our decision and selection structures, playing with if statements. You could have your ands and ors included in here, but what is it that you are trying to check for? As long as that condition remains true, the code will remain inside of this loop and continue to iterate through until this condition reaches a false state and aborts out or exits out. So playing around with what we have used to this point, it's going to be a little bit goofy since we demonstrated how easy it is to traverse logic here in a for each loop. But dealing with a while loop, purely from a demonstration perspective, we already have an array that we can work with. We already also know that an array deals with index values. So I want to really try to mimic what we've done with the for each loop inside of both the while loop and the do while loop, just purely again from a demonstration perspective. And in order to do this, we need to have what's known as a counter variable, something that can hold the index value as it increments, and we can actually go through the list item by item. So to do this, let's create a new variable called int for integer counter. So this will be an integer variable here. And the first thing that I need to do is initialize our variable. So I'm going to use an assign activity right in front of or right before the while loop. So int counter. Remember, an array starts at index 0. So I'm setting a initial default value for our index here. So this is really the counter becomes our index value. I'm initializing our value here to 0. One very important thing is as we go through this while loop, we need to add a new, add 1 to the counter as it goes through our list. So I need to bring another assign activity in here and simply say int counter, and then on the other side, int counter plus 1. Add 1 to the counter and put it back into the counter variable here. Recall what I had mentioned before on the condition side. It will stay inside our loop so as long as we have a true statement. So obviously we're going to do something with int counter. In this case, I want to make sure we stay in the loop as long as the counter is not beyond the length of our array. And I used a very important word here that we have not, I don't believe, talked about yet. And if I specify the array name and type in dot str years and type in dot length, what this is returning back to us is how many values are in the array. So what I'm telling it to do is simply count. So notice here I've initialized the array to 0. And what I'm saying is 0 less than the total number of items in our array? Well, obviously we have a bunch. What do we have? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 7 items. So this array is going to continue to stay in the loop for 7 iterations until we get to the end of 2023. To put a bit more context in this, obviously bringing a right line right above before we increment our counter. In this case, while loop, and say value of str years is, and then say str years. Then notice open parenthesis, what's the index value? The index value is our counter variable. So if we run our automation at this point, what it's going to do is continue to print out each item one at a time until we reach the end of the array. Oh, and the problem is, since I haven't done this, I want to comment this out for just a minute. It's complaining that I haven't completed my do while loop yet. So I did not mean to do breakpoint. I meant to disable this activity for just a minute so we can demonstrate the while loop. So go ahead and run our automation here. Then you'll notice our while loop. Bringing this up so we can see it. Again, this is from the for each loop. In this case, the while loop, though, 17 through 2023, we've officially walked through each record. If for some reason we had logic that was incorrect here and we over exceeded the bounds of the array, obviously we would get an error. Another thing, do not follow me here. I am going to disable our counter. This is a big programming no-no or oops that happens or can happen if we're playing with a counter variable inside of a while loop. Notice if I run my automation here, I've officially created what is known as an infinite loop. Notice the while loop never changes, and notice the code does not stop. It is now in a infinite loop. I'm gonna have to stop it, shut it down. Notice it took 12 seconds and it never moved forward. The reason why, again, is because I'm not incrementing my counter variable. So need to make sure that you have this set. So just purely a demonstration as to why that's an important concept. On the other side, let's go ahead and re-enable our do while activity. Using the same approach that we had before, we need to initialize our counter variable. Paste this in here. Again, you need to initialize, or need to be able to move your counter one at a time. And then I want to steal the right line here and paste. In this case, I want to say, instead of while loop, I want to say do while loop value of str years. And then notice my condition needs to be, in this case, exactly the same. So copy and paste. Everything is happy there. And if I run my automation here, you'll see the same exact cadence here. The main fundamental difference in this case is where does the check happen at. Remember, a while loop, it checks before it goes into the loop. A do while loop, on the other hand, will always go into the loop at least one time before it does the initial check. So it's really all about the nature of the type of logic that you're trying to do as it pertains to what type of loop you will be using. When we get into our selector demonstration and then tutorial, we will actually see a great use case for using a do while loop. So obviously not a lot of context to the fundamental differences here. Again, this is really about just understanding how do you get the logic for each of the various looping structures set up properly and configured correctly. And this concludes the tutorial on looping structures inside of UiPath Studio.